starting point this morning is that I think if we're going to mobilize enough political pressure to have the chance of a good outcome from these UN climate talks, then in a sense we need to get an awful lot better at imagining the better world that we can create if that does happen. And I often reflect that so much of the discourse about addressing the climate crisis is framed in terms of sacrifices, of giving things up and what we can't do. And unsurprisingly, that's not a very attractive proposition for a lot of people. But increasingly, I think there is a recognition that tackling the climate emergency also gives us the chance of combining both social justice and environmental justice. In other words, it does give us our best chance of creating a world that's not only greener, but a world that is fairer as well. And it's summed up in one of my favorite cartoons, which shows a professor in front of a whiteboard in their lecture theatre, and on the whiteboard behind them, they've put all of the advantages of moving to a zero carbon future. So it's got things like, you know, better, more affordable public transport, or kids playing safely in the streets again, or more nutritious local food, or proper insulation in people's homes so people aren't dying of fuel poverty in the 21st century. And then there's a speech bubble coming out from one of their students, and in the speech bubble it says, "But what if climate change is a hoax and we've created a better world for no reason?" And I think that that opportunity to create that better world is something that we absolutely need to put much higher up our organizing principles, if you like, and to really try to mobilize around that. But to create that better world, I think in a sense we have to get better at imagining it as well. And so I wanted to start, if it's okay, by reading a letter that I wrote for a collection called Letters to the Earth. You might have seen it. It's this rather beautiful looking book. It was edited by Emma Thompson, the actor, and it's published by Writers Rebel, and it's basically a whole range of different people's letters to the Earth. And my letter is called A Failure of Imagination. And it goes, "Dear artists and writers and poets and musicians, I'm writing to ask if you will help us. Will you help us protect this precious earth, to inspire us to believe that it's not too late to act, to show us that each and every one of us can make a difference, and to convince us that the system can still be changed? I ask this of you because I recognize that politics has failed. And as a politician myself, that's not an easy thing to admit. But I know that even those politicians who understand the urgency of making the transition to a zero-carbon economy have not succeeded in persuading parliaments around the world to act with the speed and determination that's necessary. In our obsession with policies and procedures and parts per million, we've appealed to the heads, but have failed to touch the hearts of the people we represent. And yet the overwhelming question we face today is one that needs not only an intellectual response, but an emotional one as well. Why didn't we save ourselves when we had the chance? Those words quite literally haunt me. I wake up in the middle of the night with them going on over and over in my head. 10 simple words that are spoken by the late, great Pete Postlethwaite in the wonderful film The Age of Stupid. He plays one of the few survivors of climate catastrophe in 2055, and as he looks back at reels of television footage, real footage from the terrible weather events from the past few years, the typhoons in the Philippines, the heat waves in Australia, the freezing temperatures in the US, he poses this simple question: why didn't we save ourselves when we had the chance? And the hairs go up on the back of my neck. It is the most important question of our time. Why is it that we seem to be content to be the species that spent all its time monitoring its own extinction and its willful and knowing destruction of its own fragile and precious home, rather than taking active steps to avoid it? Now, many reasons have been suggested. The power and vested interests of the fossil fuel companies, for example, who are increasingly not simply lobbying government, but being given senior roles within it. Or that people are just too busy trying to get by, trying to cope with putting food on the table. Or that we're being bombarded by thousands of advertisements each day, all of them persuading us to go out and consume more, to spend money we don't have, to buy things we don't need, to make impressions that don't last. But more than any of these, I think, what stops us from acting is the fact that we rarely have the courage to emotionally connect with the reality of what we're doing to our beautiful and precious Earth. Academically, theoretically, we know about the dangers of exceeding 1.5 degrees centigrade of warming. But one of the reasons we don't internalize that reality is perhaps the fear of the darkness that might engulf us if we do. How do we cope with the thought that humanity might not wake up in time, that climate change might become irreversible, that societies, even in the developed world, might no longer have the ability to respond or to cope? How do young people, in particular, cope with the reality that their parents' generation has brought this Earth close to collapse? When we really connect and feel the reality of what we're doing, such feelings of powerlessness and of despair can be difficult to escape. And that's why we need your help. We need you to paint the positive pictures of how the world could be, and to tell us the vivid and compelling stories that show us that when people come together and act, there is always hope. We need you to remind us that human beings are endlessly caring and creative and innovative, and that if we choose to, we can set our minds to anything. We despair when we have no stories to describe the present and to shape the future. And political failure is at root a failure of imagination. But with your help, we can rekindle our imagination and rediscover our power to act. So that's just a bit, put on the floor. That's just a bit about the importance of using our imaginations to really try to mobilize more energy behind the job of changing the world. And my starting point really is to go back to that question that Pete Postlethwaite poses in The Age of Stupid. Why is it, knowing what we knew then, we didn't act when there was still time? And I do think it's partly that we can't bear to imagine really what climate catastrophe looks like, that terrifying reality. But I think it's also because, in some senses, we can't quite imagine what the alternative to that is. You know, there's a famous saying, why is it easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism? And with all the warning lights on the dashboard flashing red, why are we still hurtling towards environmental breakdown? And I would argue that one of the main reasons is because we've got a dangerous and outdated economic system, one that is designed for growth and profit based on the exploitation of people and nature alike. And that the climate and nature crises are not an accident of business as usual, they are an intrinsic feature of the way we've designed our economies. Because our current economic model legitimizes greed, it promotes overconsumption, it lauds limitless growth. It's one which protects business as usual and immediate gratification over and above a safe planet where all life can thrive. Now, this idea of systems change is one that is gathering pace. Systems change, not climate change, has long been a slogan put on the banners and the placards at climate protests. And I'm sure we'll see it next Saturday too, as citizens take to the streets to demand radical action from global leaders gathering in Glasgow. And they're right, because climate action cannot be radical enough unless it includes economic systems change too. And that means making well-being rather than just economic growth the fundamental goal of our economies. And it means making climate justice our central objective. And so I'm just going to very briefly set out the context for the talks in Glasgow and then touch on 3 ways that climate justice needs to be centered in our approach. You'll know, I'm sure, that the 2015 Paris Agreement committed countries to holding the increase in the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels and pursuing efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees. And the difference that just half a degree of warming can make is massive. It's the difference between life and death for millions of people. Staying below 1.5 degrees is essential for all of us. And yet the most recent report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change warns that unless there are immediate, rapid and large-scale reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, then limiting warming to close to 1.5 degrees or even 2 degrees will be beyond reach. Right now there's been a process where different countries have been putting forward their best efforts in terms of saying how much they're going to reduce their emissions by in this next period up to 2030. And even if they all did what they said they were going to do, it would still set us on course for a temperature rise of 2.7 degrees. So not 1.5 degrees, but 2.7 degrees. And that's if they do what they say. So that is the context in which the UK is hosting these talks in Glasgow. This is why the coming decade has been called the most consequential decade in human history. And it's also why, as the host of this big climate meeting, and as the nation that led the Industrial Revolution that was fueled by coal and colonialism, that's what makes the UK have this particular responsibility to lead the transition to a sustainable, just, and resilient world in line with the science and in line with climate justice. So let me just touch briefly on 3 ways that justice absolutely needs to be central to the government's approach. And the first thing I wanted to talk about responsibility, because you'll hear some people say, you know, there's no point in the UK making radical changes because we only account for around 1% of global emissions anyway, so what difference would that make? So the argument goes, you know, when countries like China aren't acting fast enough, why should we do anything? And apart from the moral reason, I just want to set out a couple of practical reasons. And the first one is to recognize that one of the reasons that China's got high emissions is that so many other countries have outsourced and offshored their manufacturing to China. You know, we hardly do any manufacturing in the UK anymore. Much of the stuff that we consume is actually produced in countries like China. But when that happens, the emissions that are associated with those imports are put on China's balance sheet, not on ours. So every time the UK reports on its emissions, we only ever look at our production emissions in this country. We take no notice of all of the emissions that have been made in service of the products that we have then chosen to import. And so there's a big campaign that's being run saying, hang on a minute, we should be measuring our success, including our responsibility for consumption emissions, not just production emissions. We need to take account of those imported emissions that are embodied in the products that we're using here. And second, what matters for climate change is the cumulative amount of carbon that's in the atmosphere that's been pumped up there ever since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And although the UK may only be responsible for around 1% of production emissions, if you look at our responsibility for historic emissions, then it's a very different picture. Research has shown that between 1850 and 2007, the UK was responsible for more CO2, carbon dioxide, per person than any other major country. Not surprisingly, because we started the Industrial Revolution. And if you bring that up to date to where we are now, each of us in the UK is essentially sitting on around 1,200 tons of historic CO2. That makes us one of the most historically polluting countries per person in the world. So we're jostling for top spot on historic responsibility, just behind the US. But compare that with 150 tons per person for China and 40 tons per person for India. And we've got 1,200 tons. So the first thing when we're talking about justice is recognizing our historic responsibility for the climate change that is already happening. And secondly, I want to say a few words about financial justice, because you'll know that it is the biggest economies in the world that are causing the problem, but it is the smallest and poorest that suffer the biggest consequences. The G20 countries are responsible for 80% of global emissions. And that's why justice demands that we step up and ensure not only do we do much more to get our emissions down, but that we deliver on the financial promises that have been made. And I expect you've heard people talk about the fact that right back in 2009, richer countries promised to provide $100 billion a year to the global south by 2020. And shamefully, that figure still hasn't been reached. And I have to say that the UK has compromised any kind of influence it might have had in terms of persuading other countries to step up when we are the only G7 country to have cut our overseas aid in the midst of a pandemic. And that, in my view, unforgivable decision means that climate programs are being slashed, including some of the world's most climate vulnerable countries. In places like Bangladesh, the UK is actually cutting our programs in countries like that. So it's not too late to change direction, but we absolutely do need to step up and make sure that we're making a fair contribution to the finance. And also there's something called loss and damage that I want to say a few words about as well. Because for many climate vulnerable countries, It's too late to try to adapt to the climate change that is already happening. Already, they are losing sometimes 200% of GDP because of cyclones and hurricanes from which they have no real hope of having the finance to recover. And so they've put something on the agenda called loss and damage. And what they're asking the richer countries to do, basically, is to step up with a different pot of money, which we might get, for example, from a levy on the fossil fuel companies, or we could stop giving big subsidies to the fossil fuel companies. That would be another way of raising the money. And recognizing that for many, many of those poorest countries, they need that money and help now. I wanted to quote from a young Ugandan climate activist, Vanessa Nakati, who has said, "Our leaders are lost and our planet is damaged. You cannot adapt to lost cultures. You cannot adapt to lost traditions. You cannot adapt to lost history. You cannot adapt to starvation, and you cannot adapt to extinction." And that's why this new item on the agenda, loss and damage, is just so important. And finally, I just wanted to say a word again about the context for these negotiations, because as you won't need reminding, these talks are happening when the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, continues to rage in many of the poorest countries. And I just do think that if we're hoping that poorer countries will do some kind of deal with us in Glasgow, then we need to take account of the fact that only 2% of the populations of low-income countries have received even one dose of the COVID vaccine. Of the 540 million doses promised by the richer nations, just 16% have so far reached their destination. And I think that failure is a moral obscenity. And I think that it's also entirely counter to our own self-interest. So if COP26 is to succeed, I think the justified anger of the countries in the global south urgently needs to be addressed as well. So Glasgow is our chance to really step up on climate justice. It's our chance to make good on the pledges and promises we've made to some of the poorest countries in the world. It's also our chance, as I said right at the very beginning, to create that better world, to make sure it is a greener and fairer world. Because I think if we don't, then future generations will look back at this moment and wonder what on earth were we thinking.